Welcome to webinar one of our fall webinar series on infrastructure and capacity, with a focus today on our leadership and our capacity developing our leadership skills. And also, if you're watching this afterwards, welcome with you and your team. Today is September 21st, 2021, and here we go. We would like to start today with just a few acknowledgements and just honor the path that everybody has walked and everybody has followed to get to this point today. If I should, I guess, start with some introductions of myself. I assume most of us knew each other, but my name is Brad Thord, and currently I'm the Director of Oregon Response to Instruction Intervention. I'm joined today by my teammates, Dr. Lisa Bates, Dr. John Potter, Beth Ferguson, and Nicole Kay. We are down a few teammates this year. We have the retirement of David Putnam. Shelby DeFonso went to North Dakota, and Jamie Mayer went to Tiger Tualatin and ran for a new role. So we miss them terribly, but we are just down to this small little team now, and we are so grateful that you're here. And just want to honor everybody's path to this current moment, and also honor this, the impact that COVID-19, the COVID disruption has had to the implementation of our systems and the work that we have done together. We are on such a great path together, and people were doing such a great job building systems, and we've had this major disruption. And we just want to honor how difficult that has been to work and build systems through that time. But we also want to make the acknowledgement that there's this great opportunity we have right now to do some things differently and to leverage the learning that we have had in place, and also maybe this new space that we have to build more equitable systems moving forward after this disruption has ended for us. I'd just like to take a moment to talk about our fall training series. We have a series of 3 webinars designed for you, from one in September, October, and November. Today's webinar is on infrastructure and capacity with a focus on leadership. We will also be scheduling a targeted follow-up session for you in your district. So your coach will reach out to you sometime to schedule that in September and October to follow up on today's learning. We'll then host a webinar in October on the infrastructure and capacity on our building an evaluation system at the building level with a building level data review. And then once again, we'll follow up with a second session, coaching session that will be targeted to your school district sometime in October and November. And then in November, we'll be hosting our 3rd webinar on infrastructure and capacity on evaluating our systems at the district level with a district level data review. And that will be on Tuesday, November 9th. So, and that once again will be followed up with a coaching session as well, targeted at the needs of your school district. Our goals are to provide as much content and information that we believe is going to apply to most school districts, but also follow that up with targeted training and guidance for your school districts. So we understand that school districts are in different places throughout the project. We'd just like to take a moment to remind everyone here in this space of what we are and who we are. So we are Oregon Response to Instruction Intervention. And what we believe in is we believe that literacy is a civil right that should be granted to all humans and every single student in this state. Every child in every district deserves the instruction they need and deserve every day to become a reader. And it is our mission to cultivate and develop the capacity in school districts to develop multi-tiered systems of support to improve instruction for all students. One of the things we've really been working on over the last couple of years is, what do we truly believe about all means all? What do we truly believe about how we implement best practices for all students? And I'd like to share with you today our newly developed equity statement. So I would just like to read it into the space. Educational equity is eliminating disparities in student opportunities and outcomes, and ensuring that each and every child receives the instruction and supports that they need and deserve in order to develop their limitless academic and social potential. We at Oregon ORTIi recognize that educational systems have historically created and continue to sustain vast differences in student opportunities and outcomes, particularly in literacy. We believe in order to build and maintain a more equitable system, we will work to remove the predictability of reading success or failure that currently correlates with various social and cultural factors. This includes race, home language, ethnicity, social economic status, and disability status. With that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Lisa Bates, who will show us how we're going to go about making this mission a reality.
So as Brad unveiled our new equity statement, I get to unveil, or some of you may have seen this already, but I think most of you have not, our new framework. So for those of you who have been with us for a while, you remember our ORTI house. We have changed the house into a, we actually have two images now to represent that house. And it's, the first one is really just about MTSS and that framework. So as Brad talked about the importance of equity in the work that we do, we want the whole MTSS framework to sit on that plate of building an inclusive and equitable culture. Without that, we're not going to make gains for our students, and we're not going to change those disparities that we see amongst our groups. But we can't just have that only focus on an inclusive and equitable culture. We also know that we need to implement those core components of MTSS, looking at data, collaborative database support planning, which is what we used to call teaming or teaming structures. And then we also know we need those tiered supports of in instruction. And the MTSS framework really works for any kind of content area. So we know that we're implementing it for reading. We can do it for math, behavior, social emotional learning, and so forth. But to make any of that work too, we can't just be looking at just those components of MTSS for the content area that we're trying to support and build up. It's critical that we have support systems around infrastructure and capacity and our community and family partnerships as well. So this is then just the variation of that MTSS framework. And this is our, we always laugh about trying to say our ORTI framework. It's just kind of a little bit of a tongue twister, but this is our framework. And as you can see, it just, we're putting into the context of literacy and reading. So you can see just the data are the screener we use, and the other assessments that we use. The collaborative database support planning are just those meaning structures that we use, and then you can see the instructional supports as well. For the purpose of today, we're really just going to be focusing on that infrastructure and capacity piece to do that. And so why do we need to look at infrastructure and capacity? This piece is just critical for sustainability. We know that lots of things can prevent us from sustaining an innovation that we're trying to implement. You know, leadership changes, staff change. There's all sorts of things that can inhibit our ability to sustain what we're trying to do, in this case, MTSS. So we want to address that and put in systems into place to prevent that from happening. We also, I think, have an opportunity now through trying to recover from COVID to really look at our system and see where we were and where we want to be. And we can really look at it to see, what do we need to redefine in our system? How can we make it stronger from where we left off? And what have we learned that we can carry forward? I read an article recently by Jim Wright from Intervention Central, and he talked about how MTSS can ameliorate some of those challenges we had with COVID with the learning gaps that have been created. And he highlights a couple of these RE words for us to kind of focus in on. The first one he talks about is recommit. We want to recommit to MTSS, and this way, and we need to share that with our staff. You know, we've had to abandon some of the practices we've done through COVID, not because we didn't want to do them, but COVID gave us some challenges for that. So staff need to know, what direction are we going in, and that it didn't just go away because we had a little bit of, an interruption in what we're doing. So that's important. But we can't recommit to anything if we don't retrain people. We really need to look at what supports do they need, what refreshers might they need in our MTSS system to be able to support the work that they're doing. And then maybe rethink and revise some of the parts of our system that we're implementing. We learned through COVID that some of you know that we changed our core review meeting form when we were in CDL, And then we actually developed a new one now that we're back in typical school, that we still retain some of those pieces from that core review meeting that we had in CDL, particularly that engagement piece, because we know that's so critical. So there might be pieces that you can rethink or revise and to retain from that, what we've learned. And then restore. As I mentioned, we have had abandoned some of our practices that we were doing during COVID. Particularly, it was hard to do interventions to the fidelity level we want to. It was hard to do intervention review meetings because maybe we lacked the data and we weren't sure about, again, that fidelity of the intervention. So what practices are we going to restore? And really, this all comes down to resilience. When we build up our infrastructure and capacity systems, that gives us the resilience to weather these storms that we have, to weather COVID, to weather leadership leading, to weather staff leaving. And this way we can continue on and be able to sustain. So as another new form that we have, some of you may recall the Diet DB. We have changed that and we're now calling it the DIS, or the District Indicators of System Sustainability. And this is just a little snapshot of it. And as Brad mentioned, that we will be contacting you after the webinar and sometime after the webinar to set up a meeting with you to just dive deeper into this content. This is one of the things we'll dive deeper with you in, and we'll support your district implementation leadership team in thinking through some of the items on this piece. And that's going to be the content that we have for today. So in terms of sustaining systems as well, it's the fall, so we're right in the midst of football season, and my two boys who are 10 and 13 are avid football fans. They have their they're in a fantasy league, so that's pretty much all I hear now is how they're doing. They're, on Sunday and Monday, they're glued to their devices looking at their scores. But I think we can actually learn something from football organizations that we can apply to what we do in districts. There are certainly NFL teams who have had better success and had that success over longer periods of time, and other ones haven't had as much success. And there's actually, when you look at the research on what makes a good football organization, it's the things on the left that show up. They shouldn't be that surprising to us, but I think we need to really look at how much do we truly pay attention to them, and are we setting up our system to address them? And you can see that in football, the football organizational structure is set up to do that. It's set up to have decision-making authority and then go down to the next level and to the next level with the different coaches and the players. But what's key to this, we like this graphic because it showed that layered system. But one thing we wanted the graphic to have was having those arrows go both directions, because we need communication to go down and back up. And that helps create those pieces of that distributed leadership, that shared responsibility, good quality communication and systems for that communication. This way we can we build those structures so this way we can sustain. And now I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to go ahead, Brad, to the next one. Oh, yeah. So Lisa, I think you were going to do this one, but yes. I will cover it. Go. So after today, we'll give you some opportunities during some of what we had previously called team time, but now maybe just collaborative discussion, to reflect on what you have in place in the areas of leadership, both in shared responsibility and communication, and then resource allocation, which are the two big pieces that we'll be digging in today, and then giving you an opportunity to determine the next steps for enhancing the leadership structures to ensure this sustainability. Now, that said, like Brad said before, if you are somebody who is watching this asynchronously, we do still want you to do this work, because this is the whole point of this, is how are we moving forward, both thinking about where we've been in the past, how we're going to improve, and then moving forward with sustainability. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so first I'm going to dig into shared responsibility and collaboration and the leadership piece. Go ahead. So the list here of all these aspects of what you would want in shared responsibility and collaboration, all of these things on here, I've really we have been hearing from districts that we have been in communication with that they really all need somewhat of a tune-up after the last 18 months that we have experienced. And so this list of what shared responsibility and collaboration is really is a good reminder of those things. So thinking about how do we establish or reestablish that team, especially given that we might have had some changes in personnel, some changes in focus over the last 18 months or so. So reestablishing that team and using an established agenda. Refining those policies and procedures that we've had in the past. What are the lessons we've learned in the last year and a half that we want to continue to move forward? So how are we refining the policies? And how are we refining our implementation plan? Like Brad said, you may have slipped off the path a little bit, and that's okay. We all have. And so how are we going to refine that plan? And then refining the communication plan. One thing we all definitely learned during COVID is the importance of communicating amongst staff, but also among the to and from the community at large. So how are we doing all of these things? Okay, go ahead. This is like a little caution slide here. Cautions about as you're building your system. It really cannot, the whole idea of building an MTSS system that's supporting improved reading outcomes, it can't be an initiative of one or two people. We know that especially in smaller districts, if it is one or two people's work, and those people change positions or move to a new district or win the lottery and retire to one of those places we saw at the beginning of the presentation, those systems may then fall apart. So it is really essential that all the team members, depending on the size of your district, how big your team is, but all of those members must have a common and thorough understanding both of MTSS and implementing MTSS, but also the science of reading and how to scale up those improved reading practices. So it's really twofold. You have to have the content knowledge for reading, but also the knowledge of scaling up MTSS. So really thinking about who in our district and who should be on our team, who are those MTSS champions in our setting, and those people who, regardless of other staff coming and going, how do we maintain that sense of this is the way we do school? Someday we're going to have a theme song that goes with that, but stay tuned. Okay, go ahead. So thinking about your district leadership team, and I just want to clarify on this slide that for some of you, your building is your district, and yep, totally get that. And so it is kind of a combination district and building team. So we'll try to make sure we address both of those. Go ahead. So establishing that team, and this, I just want to come back to, it's called a district implementation leadership team. And some people may wonder, is this team only necessary in the beginning stages of implementation? But as you can see from this graphic here, implementation, you know, when we know from math, when you see an arrow that keeps going, it means it goes on forever. You've signed up to do this project forever, right? Because this is how you do school, is with MTSS. So regardless of where you are in your phases of implementation, and knowing that that road may have been rocky in the past couple of years, this team is the group of people who really are centered on this work. And you may have rolled this out in a phased rollout like you did in Salem-Keizer. During the past couple of years, you've had new leaders and new staff. And yes, there's been COVID. So all of that, as we're revamping this team and recommitting to this work, how are we doing that with sustainability in mind? Okay, go ahead. So the tasks of this team is a very long list, but I will just read to you a little bit of it. The task of the district implementation leadership team is to oversee the development and use of district implementation infrastructure to support schools in their use of using MTSS to scale up effective reading practices and supports for students. So the first three items on this list are really about building the why. Why are we doing this work? What is our district vision around reading and around literacy? What is it that we expect for our students? And how do we build consensus around that? How do we build and gather input from other stakeholders in the community around that vision and share that work with everybody. The next 3 items really are the how. How are we going to get this work done? How are we going to set those processes and procedures? How are we going to deal with funding, implementing, sustaining, training, coaching, supporting, all of this within the system? Second to the last thing is asking that question of looking at the data to ask, is it working? Is what we're doing working? And then the last bullet point, I think, really is one of the most important things. How are we communicating among the groups so that it's not just the DILT knowing what's going on, but everybody knows, and that input, and Nicole's going to talk about this a little bit later, but how do those feedback loops work within your district? At the bottom here, we've linked a guidance document that you either have already or will be going over with your coach at the leadership launch. This guidance document really lists all the teaming structures that you would have in an MTSS. There are agendas for those. Yeah, it's called guidance document. So that's what it is, a guidance document. So look forward to, you can either scope that out yourself or wait to talk to your coach about that. Okay, go ahead. So one of the tasks of the district leadership team is establishing that vision and communicating that vision. And I just wanted to share with you today an example that Newburgh shared with me of their vision and belief statement that really sets the groundwork for all of their work they're doing around literacy. They are really grounded in those best practices of instruction and curriculum, grounded in the science of reading, and relentlessly pursuing that civil right of being able to read for students. And they have been able to start sharing this with staff. All new teachers are aware of this statement this year. And so everything that they do comes back to these vision statements around what reading looks like in Newburgh School District. Okay, go ahead. So thinking about who is on your DILT. And again, like Lisa said, this is a good time to pause and reflect about whether you have the right people doing the work at this time. So depending on the size of your district, this team, you know, it needs to have the right people on it. How big it is sort of depends on the size of your district. Some recommended people who should be on your team: superintendent, assistant superintendents, the directors, like curriculum director, SPED director, EL, dual language people, any MTSS coordinators you have. Representation for building principals. Depending on the size of your district, you may only have a representative sample, or you may have all of the building principals. And who are those? One thing I was going to add about that is, how are those principals then getting the information from the DILT back to the rest of the principals? So everybody knows within leadership what's going on in this work. And really asking that question, whose voices are we missing in this work? That is a big lesson that we took away from the last year and a half, of pausing to ask who else do we need to include on this team, and thinking about including family and community representatives. Because if your vision is around improving literacy outcomes, we want to make sure that the whole community is on board with that. If you're in a smaller district, this list, you could be adding to it by including teachers. Maybe if you're a one school district, you want to for sure have teachers on your team, maybe an upper grade teacher, a lower grade teacher. If you're building more of a K-8 system, having somebody represent the middle school level as well. Also bringing on ESD people. There are people within your ESDs who have some of the skills and knowledge for building systems in other districts. Bringing those people on and aligning some of those systems from the ESD with your school district is important as well. Okay, go ahead. And thinking about your DILT really does need to meet monthly. This is ongoing work. We have put a couple of sample agendas in the folder, and I noticed that John did put that in the chat. So thank you, John. There's a couple of agendas in there. Whatever, I don't know which one is going to work best for your district. There's a few examples. You can take what you like from different ones and adapt them. But the point is having a set agenda that you are able to use consistently, and that people know where to find the information. Okay, go ahead. So now we have our first kind of pause and think moment, a quick write. And so I'd like to encourage you to think for a moment about some enhancements that you may have popped into your mind for your DILT as I went through all the things about the DILT here. And I'd like you to be thinking about those and then write them down on a piece of paper, perhaps write them in the chat, but you do need to have them ready to discuss with your team, even if all those people aren't here today. So thinking about, do we have a team that meets regularly? Do we need to get back into that practice? Have we articulated our vision? Are we doing the right work with the right people? Is somebody missing from this team? So I'll just give you about a minute. Okay, let's move ahead to the next slide, please, Brad. Okay, the next thing is about developing and refining those policies and procedures. So your standards of practice, checklists, etc. Go ahead. And so really it's about making a playbook. Your playbook, this is kind of a non-example here. It should not be this thick. Okay, your playbook should be rather lean, but it should include things like the standards of practice, the teaming protocols, decision rules, etc. And it's really about making sure everybody is literally on the same page about how we teach reading and how we support students in our district. And so you should also include what we're calling evaluation checklist, but it could just be look-fors and walkthrough tools. Every teacher should know what's expected and what they should be able to see when they go in a classroom as well. Okay, go ahead and click. But let me just say that the best handbook or website or guidance documents in the world don't do any good if nobody knows where they are, if the rest of the people in your building or your district don't know about them. So it literally becomes a tree falling in the forest. You use the paper to make the thing, you might as well share it out. So how do the staff access these documents? How are they updated and how are we communicating those updates so that people know, guess what? We're no longer doing it this way. Here's why, and here's the replacement behavior for whatever it is. So these are really important. Go ahead, Brad. We have created a sample standard of practice document. It really is designed to be a template that you can put your own, add your own materials, your own expectations in there. But basically what these are just your standards of practice outline clear expectations for what reading instruction looks like. And this is a huge equity piece because we want to make sure that every child in every classroom, in every school in your district gets that reading instruction that you are working so hard on improving. So we want to make sure that everybody understands this is the expectation for everyone. I don't love the term non-negotiables. It really should be about this is our agreement as a community on how we're going to teach kids how to read and how we're going to support them. Okay, and like I said, that's available in the folder as well. And we can work with you, your coach can work with you on how to adapt that to your setting. Another way to ensure that vision and mission get done, even if leaders are coming and going in a district, is to put MTSS in your board policy. So again, this is how school gets done here. So even if those key people win the lottery and leave tomorrow, the board policy says we're going to continue this work. It's kind of written into our DNA. Okay, go ahead. So again, think for a second, is there anything about policies and procedures that you just had a quick aha about? I know I went through this part rather quickly, but anything you want to remember when you talk as a team about the handbook, the standards of practice, sharing those walkthrough forms and updates.
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you everyone who is watching this recorded, and feel free to pause at any of these sections that we're outlining to take a note, have a discussion, make a little reminder for yourself to maybe come back to one of those topics or anything like that. So let's move into the developing and refining your district implementation plan. So, in keeping with our football theme, your implementation plan for reading and scaling up within MTSS is like your game plan of your coaches. So a very detailed written down sheet so that everyone, one of the huge benefits is that everyone is on the same page and there's consistency across the various aspects to your plan. Also, the purpose is to develop, coordinate, and communicate those actions. And again, we're building things, we are implementing aspects, and we're also building and implementing things in order to sustain that system over time. So we really need to, just as we have stages of implementation for our team, there's also stages of implementation with our planning. Sometimes we need to start from scratch and develop something. And other times it's more about communicating out the work and the progress that has already been done, as we've mentioned. So there are a variety of aspects of implementation plan, and I know that those of you who have been working with us over the years, you have aspects of these in place. But again, with today, we're really encouraging you to do those so re-examining, renewing, maybe revising, maybe it's just making little tweaks to your plan. Maybe you're missing an element, and that's what is kind of tripping you up a little bit in your implementation. So again, we want to center on the why. We're always centering our vision, our goals, like what we want to accomplish as a team, and our plan helps us get us there. So we want to ask where we want to get to. So what is our goal? But then what are those concrete steps? And then who will support those steps? We also need to look at our timeframes and timelines. When will this be completed? And then how do we communicate that? So I will also be kind of diving into the communication plan in a moment. But that communication plan, this is another one of these ahas where, we've learned the hard way over a few years that sometimes with the best intentions, we assume that information is disseminated in the way that we think it ought to be. But if you are not really critically examining your feedback loops and you don't have a written plan, sometimes that communication can break down and it can really become a barrier for moving forward. So that's an important part, and it's kind of subsumed within your broader implementation plan. And the how is developing an action planning document. Again, as Beth said, and as we always say, you can change any of these aspects to suit the context that you have. So you don't have to name it an action planning document. You can name it however you see fit. And there are a variety of models that you can take to have your implementation plan formatted. And I'll show you a couple of examples today. So here's one, and this is another asset or resource that we have provided in our Google folder. So again, John sent the link out to that. So same place. Here is a district action plan. And what I like about this one is it kind of, it embodies a lot of information in a distilled small format. So there are actions across the timeline. So it is organized by month. So across the entire year, it's mapped out. And then on the left-hand side on that column, the various district teams are listed. And so this is a sample that is the district-wide action plan. And so you have district teams and then those concrete steps and actions, as well as when or how long those actions will continue. And then here is that same district, so the same or similar formatting, but at this time it is a school-based action plan. Again, those team tasks are highlighted. There is a time frame, and so as you can see just by the color blocks, some actions are only during one time period and others are continuous or are spread out over multiple months. So it might take you longer to do some of this deeper, more complex work than, for example, getting that universal screening done. Additionally, with the, oh, can you go back? With the timeline, I just wanted to mention too, that sometimes you have action steps that are cyclical. So there are different time periods, or maybe annually, you always look at your disaggregated data at the district level and have a meeting about that. Perhaps, as an example, 3 times a year, you do your universal screening. So there are some things that can be planned for that occur on a cycle basis. So this one I like, there are specific actions. So here, like there is a time period for expanding their schedule of interventions, because that was something that this district needed. And also in the cells are the specific people or individuals or small group that is responsible for those tasks. So a lot of information can be distilled down in this one form, and that can really help communication and clarity. Okay, and then here is another model. This one is obviously just a template and it's wide open, but I wanted to show an additional option for action planning. So again, those of you who have worked with us before, you may have participated in filling out what we call a stair steps plan. And so the way that this kind of plan or model works is that you have a discrete goal that you place at the top right, and then you also list out kind of where you are now, and then you're backwards mapping, like what are all the discrete steps that we need to take in order to get us to our goal. These plans can be as broad or as detailed as you really want. If you want to drill down to something very nuanced and there's a lot of steps involved, this might be a great option for you. Or you might use this to communicate to your family, community, and caregivers your a 5-year goal. And so you can show them each year, each step is a year, and the goals and actions that you wish to accomplish.
Just a note about this too. Sometimes when you're doing this, it's nice to actually have the hard copy of it and actually have sticky notes in the stair steps. And you can, sometimes you might have multiple steps in one part of a stair. And then it's kind of like scheduling too. You worked really hard to do the master schedule. You walk away from it and you come back and you're like, what were we thinking? This is not going to work. So you might need to move those stickies around. So that can help.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that. This is it's a great engagement activity to get a lot of different perspectives all together and do just what you said, Lisa, and really just take, go analog and have Post-it notes and write and, really collaborate. Again, you can do it digitally too, so you can have the virtual sticky notes and kind of just gather information. And then maybe from that activity, you can develop something like the previous sample that I showed when it's kind of more finite. So great piece of information and advice. Okay, so here's another little opportunity to jot down some ahas or a note. Okay, again, if you are watching this as a recording, feel free to pause here and take your time. If you're a team gathered, this is another great place to have a short discussion. So let's move on. Thank you. And so we've been talking about it and mentioning it a few different times. So coming back to that idea of a communication plan. And again, what we mean by this is something that is written and shared and has those feedback loops that I will talk about in a moment. So in our, coming back to our football analogy, it's a little bit difficult to see here, but this is a team, like a debriefing post game to kind of go over, what went well, what maybe went a little awry, or an opportunity to teach and introduce a new play to the team. So your communication plan is that written document, and it outlines your process that you come up with for communicating to and gathering information from internal and external groups or teams. And the people that you want to be communicating with is admittedly a large group, but not everyone needs to have the same level or depth of information. But really, we want to expand our idea of who are critical people to have on, not only on our team, but who needs to be in the know and who are assets to us in terms of perspectives. And that is a really wide range. So we really want to have all of our staff that's impacted by being and helping to create and maintain an MTSS system, all staff that are involved in effective reading instruction, as well as those groups or teams that maybe are part of a more broad community of the school. We also want to have them be a part of our practices. So our communication systems, we need more than disseminating information. That is great. Like, we need to be able to communicate what the school teams are doing, or the rationale, as Beth said, of why we're implementing a particular practice or instruction, why it's so important, and how to do that. So in addition to disseminating, we also need to gather information in order to improve our practices. So we kind of frame this as a feedback loop. So internally, again, communication is very important, and we need to make sure that what our leadership team is doing is communicated clearly. So any staff whose work is impacted by reading needs to be involved and stay apprised of updates and refinements, things like the standards of practice. So if there are changes to that or additions, then staff needs to be informed and or trained, and also the handbook. In addition to that, we also want to broaden and encourage you to disseminate information and stay in close communication with your school board, at least annually if you can. So they can be a great advocate for the work and help your system move forward faster and more effectively. And so some of those communications, need to come through coaching supports or training, depending on what that information is. And then thinking through kind of our external communication. And so these are, the lifeblood of our schools and community. We want to make sure that we are informing our families and caregivers, various parent groups that we may have, and the community at large. I mean, we're proud of the work that we're doing. We have a lot of, together we've been making a lot of progress and having a lot of success, and we want to share that information. Some other pieces that we may wish to share with our broader community are, kind of giving an idea of what is, MTSS. Don't give them the long version, and please don't give that giant playbook that Beth showed us, the giant binder. But what are some basic components of MTSS, and what are the most important aspects of reading, and empowering others with that knowledge? Again, updates and refinements, and if there's some kind of positive or possible, like any kind of impact that the community may have, we want to be sharing that information. One thing that we found this helpful advice is perhaps considering having supports for staff. So specifically removing barriers to having community and caregivers take a more active role in the schools and systems. So yeah, just being creative with that piece as well. Okay. So that was disseminating information. And as I said, we also want to be gathering information and perspectives. So critical and important. Otherwise, we can really, if we're assuming too much, then we can run aground, and our best intentions can, can fall short, essentially. So we want to gather information to improve and support our practices. And internally, that might be the school board, our building implementation leadership teams, our various specialist groups. So there may be focus groups or getting information from teacher leaders or our literacy specialists or counselors or psychologists, depending on what information we need to gather, as well as our students. So getting that perspective is critical as well. And then more externally, again, parent and caregiver groups or community groups can be a wonderful asset, and we can learn a lot from their perspectives and feedback. So here is a sample. Oh, never mind. We're going to do this one first. So some of these questions, you're probably wondering, what are some questions that we can ask our both internal and external folks? Some of those things are, what's working well? It's important to highlight if there are barriers or supports that are needed, and if there's ideas about what things need to be changed. Again, we advocate using a process or a protocol for gathering and disseminating that information. And for each group, again, there might be different layers or different levels of information that they need from you and that you need from them. So just critically examining those different aspects. So here is a sample. This shows some reflection questions that a team has that they want to keep at the forefront of their minds when they are examining policies and practices. So again, just having some queued up reflection questions can really help the team be effective. Another piece that is important is evaluating that communication. So one way to gather, how well the things that you're doing are working or not is doing communication surveys and also assess the effectiveness of communication. So for example, here's just a little a snippet about, on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree, I am kept informed about critical aspects of the MTSS work. If you have a lot of folks that strongly disagree, then you may need to take some steps to alleviate that. And then also, having that communication and the concept of shared responsibility, it is really helpful to have someone who is occupying that role of coordinating the work. And so whether that's a team, whether that's an individual, thinking through the various roles. So we all have different hats that we wear, and all are really important to communication as well as our implementing of our plans. And so, what are the superintendent's roles? What about the directors? And then thinking through our structures so that we can maintain this focus. So again, we came together as a district leadership team and crafted our vision. And so we want to make sure that everything that we do is communicating that and is also moving us forward in our goals. Also decision makers and outlining that. So who has decision-making power, so to speak, across the various levels. So for example, superintendent or cabinet level, has more fiscal decision-making power, but also a team could help advocate for, specific things with a budget. So there's different levels of decision-making and the roles. All right, so we are going to do our first breakout, and we are asking ourselves, what enhancement can your district make? And so just kind of recapping, thinking through that leadership piece. What are you doing well? So how can you leverage your strengths? And what are some next steps for you? So those are kind of our structured sentences, but we're going to do breakout and
okay, so now she said there's a couple of components for leadership. We're now diving into the resource allocation part to that. So the resource allocation piece really revolves around thinking through your initiatives, and I'll explain kind of what we mean by an initiative on the next slide. So an initiative is really those, it could be a product, so it could be like an intervention, a processes, so it could be like your PLCs, it could be strategies like effective instruction, or approaches like PBIS or MTSS, but really the point to them is to improve upon the status quo. So we want to take it, there should be a reason why we're doing it. It should be to improve our practice. And the other important component too is that we're doing it to reach scale. We don't want it just pockets of excellence. We want to make sure that we have that consistent excellence throughout our district. So just some other things about initiatives. We certainly want them to be evidence-based. They do, it takes really time and planning to implement them effectively. I think that's a lot of times why initiatives get abandoned, is because we don't take the time to plan how we're going to implement them effectively. No surprise, we need to dedicate resources and support to it. And it is also really helpful to think of how we're going to remove barriers to those implementing. Sometimes maybe an area that we have to think about. And it goes back to, we're in a unified agreement that this is the direction where we want to move. You can move forward. And interestingly, okay, that's okay. So more why is just, again, goes back to that alignment. We want those communication pieces all to go together. We want everyone working towards that same goal. So this is just a highlight to give you that reminder about how you're structuring your system to do that. Okay, go on. So now we're going to dive, go back one. And go back. So now we're just going to dive into initiative. Initiatives. Actually, I can speak without it. How you evaluate initiatives, and also how you get stakeholder input to be able to select or deselect initiatives for it. Okay. Okay. So so what happens oftentimes with initiatives? We kind of chase those shiny objects. And what was interesting, oops, that's okay. They in the business world, there's actually a name for it. There is something actually called the shiny object syndrome. So who knew? But basically, you can see the little cartoon there, the squirrels who, and the dogs. The dogs are, one, the main dog is trying to get them to focus. And of course, the dogs are just looking at the squirrel. So that's that shiny object. If we're always chasing something else, it becomes harder to implement things. So we look at the mountain example. The person's climbing the mountain, and so it takes effort to get there. It takes support for them to get up the mountain. But if we just say, oh, that's a better mountain, we're going to have to climb back down the mountain that we just came up and climb back up the new mountain. So every time we do that, we're losing effectiveness and efficiency and even people's energy. You don't want to be climbing up and down mountains. So that's why we just suggest a process to kind of really look at how you're choosing your initiatives and how well, how you're looking at how you implement them. So here's the tool that we have. The little picture in the upper right-hand corner is called the hexagon tool. We have that linked for you, and it's in the resource folder. But essentially what it comes down to is looking to see is what are we going to implement and how well can we implement it? So we have these, a framework for you to think through that piece. So first we want to look at need. And that's always the balancing act between what you want and what you need. And we want to, oops, go back. That piece. So basically, for example, you look at your data and you see that in your district, a lot of the kids are not reaching benchmark in their phonics screen assessments. So we might say, okay, we need to enhance our phonics. The core program isn't robust enough in that. So maybe we'll purchase ECRI, which is Enhanced Core Reading Instruction. So we get that. And then we need to look at fit. It could be, so ECRI is very explicit and systematic instructional routines to support the teaching of phonics by giving kids lots of practice. But if your staff are have not bought into explicit and systematic phonics, you're going to have to work on that. That's where the stakeholder pieces are going to come in to to match that need and to just figure that out, how it's going to be a fit. And then there's resource availability. So we know we need to put resources to it too. So ECRI is, they try to make it as affordable as it can be, but it also takes resources to train staff on it. And do you have those resources to do that? Then there's evidence. You want to make sure that there is actually evidence of the product or initiative that you're looking for, that it's actually been shown to work. And then readiness for replication. Oh, go back one. So, so this is kind of hard to tell what it is, but it's actually a wave pool in Japan. This was pre-COVID. Hopefully they would not be doing this now. But so they're all very happy. They're used to that and they're comfortable with that. If we had done that, here in the US, we probably wouldn't be quite as comfortable with that type of a wave pool. So that's kind of what we need to think about in terms of as we're rolling out an initiative. Just because it's been done in one place doesn't mean it can as easily be done in another place. So for example, in the past, when we had lab school visits, you might have came to Tiger Tualatin and seen some teachers delivering ECRI. But so you might think, oh yeah, I want to get ECRI and do it in our district. But maybe not realizing that then that moves to what capacity do we have to implement that? So you can move ahead to the capacity picture and to see then how, what Tiger Tualatin did was they had the resources by personnel who were dedicated to support the use of ECRI. You might not have that. So it's not that you're not going to do it, but it's just that you need to think through what that's going to look like and how you can make sure to implementing it well. Good. And then the next piece just to look at is really how you engage those stakeholders piece to it too, because we don't have those stakeholders as a part of the decision making. We know it's going to fall apart. We're not going to have the buy-in. We're not going to be addressing the barriers to it. So this is just a little framework that tells you how you can think about those stakeholders. So again, we have it linked for you. And again, we have it in our resources. But basically it's thinking about who needs to be a part of this decision making. That's identifying who's there. So for ECRI, you probably want some teacher representatives along with literacy specialists and principals. Analyzing then, you need to go back to why is this important? Why are we doing this? So it needs to look at, again, going back to our data. We need this because our data are showing us that our core isn't robust enough and we need to fill that hole. And why isn't that important to teachers? Because teachers want kids to make progress. They want to see that. And it's important to students because we all want them to make progress. Then the next piece is just mapping and thinking how much involvement do we want them to have? Do we want them to, do we just need to inform people? Do we need to consult with people, more involve them? Is it collaborative or are we co-creating something with them? And kind of just having in your head to know how then you can manage that meeting or the meetings you're going to have through that stakeholder process to make decisions around what you're implementing. And then lastly, just that you would plan to remove like what barriers are there, what can help this process along. So for ECRI, it could be that we don't have a dedicated person to sort of help us with this, but who else can fulfill that role? Okay, I think we're going to skip this piece and Beth will go on to the rest of resource allocation.
Yeah, I do want to point out, though, that if you are watching this asynchronously, the last part really, the pause point, you can still take it because you're not as behind as the real life one. So that's the advantage of doing this asynchronously, but really thinking through the process of selecting and deselecting initiatives and engaging stakeholders in that work. So now I'm going to move on to how do we align those initiatives. Go ahead, Brad. And we have included yet another tool in this robust folder of tools that we linked in the chat earlier. And it really is about aligning the initiatives that you have and make sure that they are not only aligned with each other, but aligned also with the work that you're intending to do, that this is how we're teaching reading in our school district. So do those initiatives, maybe do the same thing so they're redundant. Do they contradict each other? They work in opposite ways. Do they complement each other? Or do they require the same staff so that you're overburdening some people? Going back to Lisa's ECRI example, you might have with your previous core program, needed ECRI, because like she said, the phonics instruction was not robust enough. It was not explicit enough. It didn't give enough opportunities for practice. Now, that's great. And there's going to be a new adoption coming up. Perhaps your new curriculum, your new core program might have some of that built. It might be better at the explicit instruction in some of those foundational skills. And so you would need to really be aligning, like working through this tool. Are we doing the work doubly, or could we let ECRI go at this point? But what I really want to say here is that's not an individual teacher's decision to let that go, given the new program. It's really making a district-wide decision, looking at the evidence, looking at the robustness, trying it out, making sure the data say, yep, we can let ECRI go now that we have this other program. But it's really about how are we aligning those district initiatives and making sure that that is made in a wise way. Okay, go ahead. And then allocating resources to support those initiatives and materials. Go ahead. So really thinking about the equitable, not the equal, but the equitable distribution of those resources. So thinking about time, staff, coaching and support, space, and all of those really do come down to money. How are we making sure that that's done equitably? Okay, go ahead. And then finally, in resource allocation, what are some barriers and identifying those that might be getting in the way of these new initiatives that we're trying to use and/or the use of materials? So for example, do we have some barriers, some policies or procedures in our district around who can serve certain students or who can use certain materials? Do we have things that are sort of getting in the way about how we're using our professional development time or teaming time, or even about how RTI can be used for special ed identification? It's really important going forward that within your district leadership team agenda, that you have a way for those barriers to be brought up so that the team is able to tackle them. So going back to what Nicole was talking about, how are we getting feedback from the people who are doing the work to the district team to say, hey, we've identified a barrier. We'd like some help breaking down this barrier. And so really within your teaming agenda for the district team, having this topic of implementation challenges and how do we address those challenges around all of the things that the resources that we're trying to allocate. Okay, go ahead. And then finally, putting it all together, I know I said at the beginning, we don't have the world's greatest agenda that ensures absolute implementation magic. There are lots of them, a few examples, not lots, a couple of examples in the folder. But this one, I just want to show an example of how it might be put all together. One of those sample agendas in there really does do this. It has communication from team to team. There's way more pages of this, but communicating among and between teams. It's defining the teams. It's got a place to identify the barriers and how we are breaking down those barriers, has a part for resource allocation, and then really who is going to do the work. And I think that regardless of the district size, that's an important piece. Who are the champions? Who's going to do the work? And how are we going to communicate all of this to our community? And now I will turn it over to Brad.
Thank you very much, Beth. We will not take the moments right now to pause and do breakouts, but we encourage you and your team, when you do meet and meet again, have this conversation about resource allocation and how you can implement some of these tools and strategies and these questions in order to align what you're doing in order to achieve better outcomes for all students. So this brings us to the topic of our next webinars, is the part of leadership of evaluating our systems. So our next two webinars will focus on developing robust systems both at the district level and the building level in order to do this, to implement with fidelity a systematic approach to monitoring the implementation of MTSS across our district and across our schools. And also a systematic approach to collecting and analyzing student outcome data that's disaggregated across student groups. Are we truly having the impact we want on all student groups? Is our system working for all students? And who is it working for and who is it not working for? And we're going to work on establishing these database decision-making processes, both at the district level and at the school level, so we can understand, is our system working for all students? Who is it working for? Who is it not working for? Are we implementing their systems as intended? How do we know? And then how do we improve those processes? One of the things that we'll be working with you in your districts is our coaches and I will be reaching out and we'll be scheduling a follow-up session, and we'll be diving into these district indicators. Once again, Lisa mentioned that this replaces our old tool of our DILT DB. And this new tool is our district indicator and system sustainability that focuses on all the indicators that you need to have in place for infrastructure and capacity in community, community engagement, all those pieces you need in order to build a system, an equitable system on top of that. And so our coaches will be reaching out to you to schedule some time to enhance this learning and to work with your teams in order to go through this. Once again, I just wanted to remind us of our fall training series. This is webinar 1 about leadership in our infrastructure capacity. Webinar 2 will work on the database decision-making at the building level and with a follow-up session from our coaches. And webinar 3 will focus on the district level data review, once again with a follow-up session from our coaches sometime in November and December. But as far as it goes for today, that is pretty much all the time we have. And if you would like to stay after and ask us some questions, we'll shut this down and we'll stop recording. We can have some conversations as well. But please link to our evaluation form here in the presentation. We'll also throw it in the chat. If somebody could please do that and add that to the chat. We do believe in feedback and we do look at it and we do take it to heart. It does make us better. So please help us improve our supports for our districts that we're currently working with, and also other districts across the state of Oregon and beyond. And so your feedback is critical and important to us.